I just wanted to make everyone aware that the North Pacific Research Board's call for pre-proposals for the Northern Bering Sea Integrated Ecosystem Research Program is now on the NPRB website. So if you go to www.nprb for North Pacific Research Board.org and look for the Northern Bering Sea Integrated Ecosystem Research Program, you can find information there. I encourage you to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. And note that she's put the link in the chat box so people look at that for the recording. Are there any other updates that people like to provide? I mean, I'll say a few things then about because I just got back from Poland for the Atlantic DBO. The reason I bring this up because they're putting together an endorsement for the Pan-Arctic Distributed Biological Observatory because there's a Siberian DBO in development, Davis Strait, the Pacific one that we've had going in the Atlantic. And I would also point out we had the Pacific Arctic Group. Danielle was there at the meeting we had in Tokyo. And what was interesting, there were about 50 to 60 people there. We will have a report out and we'll post it on the Pacific Arctic Group and I'll give an update later. But you can actually see the presentations once we get the report written because we'll have them linked. The interesting point that brought out is we had multi-nations there because the G7 was having discussions by countries, and they have endorsed observing as a component of that. There was also, but we also had folks from India, which we normally haven't had at the Pacific Arctic Group, that are interested in working with the Japanese on their new icebreaker, and they are going to be joining the Pacific Arctic Group. So we had representatives from almost all the countries that are working in the Pacific Arctic, as well as some new ones that are interested in joining at the international level. And yeah, so I would say that, and then that was a big icebreaker meeting, and then related to the Japanese, and there were many international groups there talking about the type of science, including the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement aspect that John Bengtson will talk about, the automated information system, things that Arthur Berkman will talk about, and yeah, so it was a successful meeting. And then the other one was the Nansen Legacy, which is a big Norwegian international program that's been going on, funded by the about 150 million by the Norwegian government. I would just point out they're building a 10-year program into the Central Arctic Ocean Basin as a cooperative there. So that information, that'll be something they're planning and probably feed into the International Polar Year. The other thing, if many of you probably have seen, that the Norwegians have planning to do deep sea mining. So this is an issue. It just came out I knew it was coming into the news today that they're discussion in their government. So there's more and more activities planned for the high Arctic that are under discussion, beyond having transportation issues, international issues, national security, and climate change. So with that, I'm going to go. Anybody else want to say anything? Okay. Well, at that point, I think that we will not have, I've just closed before I introduce Paul, is that we will not have a webinar for the marine ecosystem team in January because there's the Alaska Marine Science Symposium. For those of you who probably know, the February meeting, there's the Ocean Sciences meeting, and there will be sessions on the Synoptic Arctic Survey internationally that was undertaken into the high Arctic. I specifically would say that, as well as multiple Alaskan and Arctic sessions that will go on in that particular program meeting that will occur in New Orleans. So with that, I think, anything else? Yes, Danielle?
Thanks, Jackie. I also wanted to make everyone aware that there will be an IARPC post-2023 field season meeting where folks who were out in the field in 2023 will be invited to report on what they found and talk about challenges and successes from this past field season as we begin thinking about next year. So I encourage you to join that. I believe it's on January 17th.
Great, thank you. That's why we're not having our own marine ecosystem webinar, because we're joining with the other teams for that ship-based one. Oh, and there's so people are putting things in the chat. That's great, related to any other activities. So with that, I think unless there's anything, I see any hands, which I don't, that I would just go ahead and I'll do a brief introduction for the, let's see, one more message. Oh, some international happenings and haven't yet been seen. So anyway, it's in the link that's, that Heather sent a note upon. Okay, so with that, I'd like to have our first speaker, which is going to be Paul Berkman, as I have already introduced. And Paul, if you want to go ahead and start to share your presentation, I just reiterate he's going to be discussing the ship traffic information and high Arctic issues and integrating that marine traffic information into a variety of topics. So once his talk comes up, then we'll be able to have him proceed.
Share screen.
Okay, I can see it.
Okay, good. Display swap. Can you see that?
Yes, that's good. It's in display mode. Okay.
Okay, good. Before beginning, I just want to acknowledge in Falmouth, Massachusetts, I live on the unceded lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag, who are the traditional guardians of the associated ecosystems on land and in the surrounding sea. I respect Indigenous peoples in the state, across the nation, and around the world as traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. I honor courageous Indigenous leaders, past, present, and future. So with that, I thank you, Jackie, for the opportunity to share the observations about from the beginning. About Arctic maritime ship traffic, specifically focusing on a project initiative that's been initiated over the last several years called Arctic Satellite Knowledge, with the acronym of ASK. With respect to the ecosystem group and thinking about what the ecosystem is in the largely context of a system, I have two slides here. One shows the dynamics of the Arctic, including many components, land and terrestrial and marine, biogeophysical system, as well as the socioeconomic system. And on the right is a map of four intersecting components. One, the Indigenous peoples organizations in a circumpolar context, as well as the nations in a circumpolar context around in the Arctic. Then there's a picture of the minimum sea ice extent that was achieved in 2012. And then the red line is the Central Arctic Ocean high seas, which is the focus of this discussion. So a number of intersecting elements in terms of the presentation today, thinking in terms of inclusion, inclusion involving basic questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. And just as a note, I have included details in the slides beyond what I will discuss so that the slides are available on the IARPC website for others to review afterward as helpful. The presentation today, with respect, involves leadership from the Indigenous peoples in the Alaskan Arctic. This project, ASK, the Arctic Satellite Knowledge, is centered around leadership and guidance coordinated from the Aleutian Islands in particular. The history of this project is shown going back to 2009, when I was at the University of Cambridge, and the first satellite observing data for the ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean began. And just at the same time, the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment was produced through the Arctic Council. And so this has been a long journey in terms of understanding, interpreting, using the Arctic ship traffic record in ways that are helpful to many different organizations, initiatives, projects, questions. In terms of the presentation itself, I'll be talking about Satellite Automatic Identification System data, SAIS data. This is mandated under the Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, and it is a threshold change in terms of the ability to address questions with marine ship traffic from what was initially discussed through the Arctic Council, through the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. And so in a sense, thinking about next generation Arctic marine shipping assessments. One of the values of the Satellite observations is that it is synoptic on a pan-Arctic scale. The other observation, which is important, is that the ability to analyze ship traffic on a pan-Arctic scale goes directly to the application of the law of the sea in the Arctic Ocean. And just as a note, from the 8 Arctic nations and the 6 indigenous peoples organizations in 2013, in their vision for the Arctic, they identified that we remain committed to the framework of the law of the sea. And I would just note that Lisa Murkowski is again proposing that the United States ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The data set itself, going back to 2009, has been put into the Arctic Data Center so that it is open access and to facilitate knowledge discovery as the baseline for the satellite record of ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean. And I would just note, in terms of the law of the sea, that thinking about the central Arctic Ocean is a special circumstance in the sense that this is a region beyond national jurisdictions, and it provides an opportunity for nations to look outward in terms of their common interests, in contrast to nations looking inward into the Arctic Ocean from their national boundaries in terms of national interests. The methodology that I'll share with you briefly in terms of the presentation involves the space-time cube, which is effectively geographic information system on steroids, allowing to analyze big data in this context at the level of granularity that's defined over space and time by the users. In this context, from 2009 to 2018, there were 173 million SAIS records involving 21,000 ships that become part of the interpretation. A basic analysis that was used to demonstrate the power of the space-time cube was to objectively analyze ship traffic in all of the law of the sea zones north of the Arctic Circle. So this figure shows the law of the sea zones, all of the exclusive economic zones of the Arctic coastal states, as well as the high seas areas north of the Arctic Circle, as illustrated in that picture. You can see a number of things. You can see that there is pronounced seasonality in terms of ship traffic. You can see the relative amount of ship traffic. Norway having the largest amount of ship traffic in the sense that the Barents Sea is open water during much of the year, if not most of the year in some of these areas, in contrast to areas that are seasonally ice covered. The primary feature of showing this picture is that the seasonality itself represents effectively the biogeophysical system, sunlight turning on and off, the marine mammals moving in and out of different areas and so on. But at the same time, the ship traffic is tracking the seasonality, and the impacts in the relationship between the biogeophysical system and the socioeconomic system are fundamental to interpreting, in the context of the Central Arctic Ocean High Seas Fisheries Agreement, which John Bengtson will talk about. They're fundamental to interpreting and developing a precautionary approach. This is a picture of the types of questions that can be addressed. So in this picture on the left, you can see the predominance of the 5 major nations that have ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean. Certainly Russia in relation to the Northern Sea Route, but other nations that have the most number of ships during the period of 2009 to 2018. On the right, in the Central Arctic Ocean high seas, which is mostly ice covered, you can see diversity of ship traffic in terms of the nations by the flag state of the ships. The flag state is among the metadata that are available with the SAIS records. And so it's a very complicated region. Even though it's not open water yet, there is significant movement of ships in the Central Arctic Ocean high seas. And this is the question as to how this will evolve over time. And part of the rationale from 2009 forward is to establish a baseline that addresses the ship traffic so that the changes can be characterized from a base state. One of the questions that was involved in looking at the Central Arctic Ocean in high seas in specific is where were the ships coming from? Recognizing icebreakers can move independent of open water sea ice. The question is the diversity of ships. Where are they coming from? And this led, in a sense, was designed in terms of a hypothesis that ship traffic is increasing as sea ice is decreasing. So in a sense, this framing assumed that if there was more ship traffic coming in from the Barents Sea, which is where most of the ships were, that hypothesis would be falsified. And what we found in effect is that most of the ship traffic coming into the Central Arctic Ocean high seas is coming through the Pacific sector. And you can see the other types of ships and the types of ships, the flag states, the ships, the tonnage of the ships. But the predominant and the message that's important, especially for this community of interagency Arctic research focus, is that the ship traffic into the Central Arctic Ocean is coming predominantly from the Pacific sector, which means that all of the coastal communities along the Alaskan Arctic are specifically susceptible to the increase in ship traffic. And so as the Central Arctic Ocean becomes increasingly ice-free, the risks and the challenges to address in relation to that ship traffic become most pronounced from the US Arctic into the Arctic Ocean. The ability to integrate the satellite record of ship traffic is open-ended in the sense that any type of data can go into the space-time cube. And so in this figure, what we've done is we've integrated the satellite record of sea ice with the satellite record of ship traffic at scale. And what you can see is that the ship ice interactions is actually increasing over time. Again, looking at the hypothesis that Arctic ship traffic is increasing as sea ice is diminishing. The pronounced movement of ships northward, the pronounced movement of them across longitudes is represented in this type of analysis. It's analogous to what could be done with ocean color, with specific types of data sets dealing with marine mammal distributions or fish stocks or anything else that would be available to integrate into a space-time cube analysis. Just in terms of the overall dimensions of and implications of having the ability to analyze at scale the ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean, it goes directly to the 5 binding agreements that are in force with the United States as among the signatories. It goes directly to the Arctic Council and all of the other organizational entities that rotate on a biannual basis, including the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, the Arctic Economic Council. And it goes directly to cross-cutting relevance of the United States in terms of Arctic strategies, recognizing the current Arctic strategy has the United States seeks an Arctic region that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. The ability to analyze the satellite information is independent of national approval. We have the ability to look at the Arctic in a pan-Arctic context. And I would just note in terms of the implementation plan for the 2022 National Strategy for the Arctic Ocean, Objective 1.11, the very first objective, has observational capabilities, including sea ice and ship traffic. So it's a cross-cutting relevance to IARPC and to the United States, and is intended here just as a means of introducing and elevating the focus on maritime ship traffic in ways that intersect with the various residents of the Arctic, indigenous peoples in particular, the various communities of practice, the types of institutions that are involved. And with that, I'll just close by saying, what questions do you want to ask? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, very much. If people have questions, you can raise your hand and or put them in the chat box and we can look at them from there. So Paul, how do you see with the agreements that are in play, and also I guess the pending biodiversity agreement, and these all have an interface with any type of stakeholder activities or commercial activities in the Arctic, and I think you're saying that everything is increasing on that. So I guess question is, are there concerns with, are there agreements in place that will put some need to have the studies done before for like the environmental connections, or are they the same issues that we as scientists have to have when we're working in areas and coastal communities or working in the high Arctic, the same as commercial traffic has to follow rules? I'm thinking of migration, ship strikes, things like that.
So good question. And I'll just use the focus on the Central Arctic Ocean high seas. Among the 5 agreements, indigenous peoples as a term, indigenous, occurs more frequently in the Central Arctic Ocean High Seas Fisheries Agreement than any of the other binding agreements. So even though it's not directly related to the coastal areas, in terms of the question, the Central Arctic Ocean High Seas Fishery Agreement has as an objective over the next 16 years to interpret a precautionary approach. So what is precaution in relation to the impacts of human activities? And it's not just fishing vessels. There's a diversity of vessels, of diversity of nations, of sizes of ships, cargoes of ships, and those types of questions are cross-cutting. They relate to the interpretation of fish impacts for sure. They relate to marine mammal strikes, for example, or bird strikes. They relate to pollution impacts. And so in a sense, it's a cross-cutting challenge to interpret what the ship dynamics is in relation to the biogeophysical system, as well as the various regulatory environments.
Okay, thank you, Paul. There is a question by Captain Pandey. If you'd like to, I think he raised his hand, Danielle said.
Yes, so good afternoon, Paul. This is Captain Pandey from Massachusetts Maritime Academy. I'm your neighbor, and of course I've been sailing in the region that of course we are all talking about. So one of my questions was that this whole satellite AIS, is it any different from the terrestrial AIS that of course I have been using? In my years in, let's say, in 2003, 2004, I also managed to use a satellite AIS. Is it any different from the current, the way we kind of monitor traffic in the Arctic, or is it the same you're talking about?
Thank you, Captain Pandey. The satellite automatic identification, SAIS, and terrestrial automatic identification system are complementary. The terrestrial system data with receivers on shore has a limitation of line of sight. So if we're looking beyond the line of sight, let's say 40 miles off the coast, then the question becomes, what are the ships that are coming into the coastal areas? What type of activities and impacts at an operational timescale need to be anticipated? So the satellite AIS and the terrestrial AIS are complementary. They have different utility. The opportunity to look beyond the horizon is available with the SAIS. The density of information that's collected with terrestrial receivers is higher than from satellite because the satellite passes every 90 minutes or so. So the two are complementary. They're not the same. They provide different utility. And so one of the questions, certainly in relation to the Coast Guard mission, for example, in terms of emergency response, is the search and rescue agreement from 2011 or the marine pollution preparedness response agreement from 2013 on a pan-Arctic scale, how to implement those. And you can imagine having a set of terrestrial receivers would provide some context, but it wouldn't provide the type of implementation necessary on a pan-Arctic scale. And so this is the opportunity, and the challenge is one of integrating the satellite automatic identification system with the terrestrial, and noting that significant progress has been made and contributions from the Alaska Marine Exchange over the last number of years, which has a robust terrestrial system along the Alaskan Arctic.
Yeah, that's well put. And my next question was that do we still have the issue with the user? So for instance, if the user switches off the AIS, as someone who has sailed quite a lot, that was pretty much prevalent. If a ship wants to protect its trade routes, it's simply not going to switch it on. And whether it is satellite derived or terrestrial derived, we still have the same situation that we will not be able to track that ship.
So it's a good question, and it's an area in a sense that's open for specific research. We have different types of sensors, the radar sensors that would be able to track ships independent of the automatic identification system, would allow us to interpret good actors and bad actors, and potentially schemes like fish tracking schemes that determine whether the fish was legally caught or illegally caught could be applied to ships in terms of their turning on and off the satellite automatic identification system transponders. So it is a question, the percentage of ships, the types of ships, the nationalities of ships that are good actors versus bad actors lends itself to a variety of questions and potential types of responses with the International Maritime Organization, for example. But it is a real problem, and it's a problem in particular with fisheries. And we are working with the Global Fishing Watch, which is trying to address this problem as well.
Thank you.
Yes,
I think
and the
we're gonna
last
have,
one.
yep. I think we're gonna
And
have
the
to
last
stop.
point.
'Cause-
Yeah,
No,
sure.
I have to, if you could put it in the chat, well, it would be great, because there is one question
Okay.
I'd like to bring forward, and then we can come back at the end of this, as John Bengtson's joined us, and he's right in a break of his meeting. So John, but let me put the question out there, so then as we put your talk up, is coming from, let's see, the question is from Anita. To what extent is Russia increasing its domain awareness, and as you have spoken in terms of hybrid threats to NATO and the West to reshape the existing norms, and perhaps alter post-Ukraine, and to some extent along with China, the rules-based order? So that's it's something you might not be able to address now, but that's the question. If you could just spend a minute, and then I'll get John. Let me do the introduction of John, so you can answer that question while he puts up his slides.
Okay,
John
so
Bengtson is going to join us from NOAA National Marine Mammal Lab. He's at a meeting, and he's in break time to talk about the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement and the proposed monitoring plan. So John, welcome. I'm going to have you share, and then if you could answer that question quickly and then come back to it, Paul, that would be great.
Just in terms of the context of automatic identification system analyses, it allows us to interpret threats and impacts in a pan-Arctic context without permission of any of the nations. So we are able to assess ship activities throughout the Russian Arctic, as well as any other segment of the Arctic. And so the transparency that's available with the automatic identification system is actually an enhancement in terms of calibrating the types of discussions that would ultimately promote peace and stability in the Arctic.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And I hope that answered. If there's more questions, we can bring them up at the end, kind of like a little panel discussion. But I want to introduce, I already have introduced John Bengtson. I'm pleased that you're going to be able to give us an update on the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement and plans for the joint monitoring program.
Thank you, Jackie. Let me start with an audio check. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
That's amazing.
I know, it's great after
Okay.
what we had in Japan.
All right, and I want to greet everyone. And I'm only on one small screen here in a borrowed office that happened to be unlocked. And I don't know exactly what's going to happen when I share my screen. So I'll bear with me for a moment. I'll try to share it now and see if it comes up correctly.
John, if it doesn't work, I have it pulled up here, so I'm happy to share from my end as well.
Okay, let me see if I can do it here. You know what? Let's go with yours, Meredith. I have the feeling if I share this, I'm going to lose the ability to see it. Why don't you see, how will this work? I'll go back to cancel that. And
Yeah, and
then
we can, you can
and
put
I'll
it in
squeeze.
display mode and you can talk.
Yeah, but I have to get into, I'm going to run it on my end too, just because I can keep track of what click you're on. Okay, I was afraid to do this before I dialed in, but I can do it now. Oh, boy. All right, Stan, sorry. Take 30 seconds of my time here.
That's
All
okay.
right. So, well, I'm pleased to talk to you and join you all today to talk a little bit about what's happening with CAOFA. That's the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, and commonly known as CAOFA. And yep, you've got, let me do this last bit here. You've got the first slide up, and I'm going to go to that as well. All right. All right, that didn't work. Okay, I'm just going to fake it. So, and basically, I wanted to have two points. I wanted to brief the IARPC folks that are tuned in about sort of what's happening in CAOFA and the science. And then also, I think there are opportunities from some of the agencies or entities that are involved in the IARPC for collaboration. Next slide. Next slide, please. And the formal name of this it's a new treaty. It came into force a little over 2 years ago.
John, I just want to let you know that your
The agreement
internet.
to prevent unregulated, the shorthand name for that treaty, or abbreviated to CAOFA.
John, I want to let you know that your internet might be a little bit slow. And so if you turn off your video, it might help with the bandwidth.
Okay.
And that's probably why it feels like there's a lag on the slides as well.
How about now?
I hope that helps. Yeah, we'll see.
Okay, if not, I can dial you up on my iPad, which has a cell signal. That might be faster. I don't know.
It's sounding good right now.
Yep.
Okay, so I was just going to say a few brief words. Many of you, I hope, know about this new agreement. It's an important one. It started with the 5 coastal states: Norway, Russia, US, Canada, and Greenland, Denmark, saying with the rapid melting in the high Arctic, the high seas area up there, that those areas outside of the 200-mile territorial limits of the 5 coastal states, shown there in light green, that the high seas become more available to ships. There may be some interest. I think there probably is some interest in fishing up there. And the 5 coastal states said, let's get together and see if we can agree convention to regulate any commercial fisheries that may occur up there. And they started talking, and next slide, or at least next click, I think let's see what happens. Yeah, they were joined by 5 non-coastal states: China, Korea, Japan, Iceland, and European Union, and completed the drafting of the agreement, and they signed it. Those are the original 10 parties. And those all were ratified, and the treaty came into force in 2021. Next slide, or next click, I guess I should say. The CAOFA follows, an important part of this is it follows a precautionary ecosystem approach in marine ecosystems. It's really important. I can consider it an ecosystem agreement, not just a fisheries agreement. Next, click. And the whole idea is that any potential commercial fisheries that do occur up there will be managed and regulated in the consideration of impacts not only on target fish species, but also systems up there that might be affected, in other words, by commercial fisheries, impacts on ecosystem interactions, and potential impacts on indigenous communities. So that's a big deal. And next click. And that management, the management decisions that are taken by the Conference of Parties of CAOFA are to be guided based on science and indigenous knowledge, all knowledge really. And to get the information that they need, they established a joint program of scientific research and monitoring, abbreviated, of course, as the JPSRM. And that's what I'm going to say a little bit about today. Next slide. Before I do, I just want to make a point about geography. That black polygon area in the middle of the slide there, that demarcates the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean, and the south of that black line at all longitudes, those are the territorial waters. CAOFA has the authority under the treaty to regulate fisheries inside that agreement area, north of the black line. But what's important to remember is that the treaty or agreement takes into account the impacts of what is regulated and happens inside that area, the impacts outside of the agreement area as well, which includes I've highlighted there in some light blue text, the peripheral seas, so that's the continental slopes and shelves that are in territorial waters. And I've shown that in a couple of places, as well as what's being called the Atlantic and Pacific gateways. So that's a big area, and the indigenous and local communities that might be affected. So they have authority to regulate north of that black line, but they're required to take into account ecological and, I think, social impacts south of that black line. That's a key point to bear in mind. Okay, next slide. So here's the kind of a rough order, a little bit about the flow chart here. There's CAOFA. The decision-making body is called the Conference of Parties, or COP, kind of standard language for agreements like this. Under the COP is the Scientific Coordinating Group, SCG. I'm the current chair of that group, and all parties are represented. All of the 10 parties are represented on the SCG. The SCG has 2 working groups that are relevant to our conversation today. One's called Mapping and Monitoring. Another one's called Data Sharing, about to become the Data Management Group. So there's a data group and a mapping and monitoring group. We'll come back to that in a few slides. Those 2 working groups under the SCG they have developed a framework for the JPSRM. That's a public document now. If that's of interest, I can make that available. Maybe you've already seen it. If you haven't, contact me and I can direct you to it. So it's that JPSRM, the joint program, that I just want to talk a little about in a few minutes here. Next slide. Okay, the JPSRM is the key questions that drive the work and provide the focus, the scientific focus of the JPSRM are outlined here. There are 5 questions. I'll just say them briefly here. I'm not sure if you can read this. It talks about what are the distributions and potential for future commercial harvest of species in the Central Arctic Ocean. So that's one. Where are there potentially exploitable fish? How many are there, and what's the stock status and so forth? Number 2, what other information is needed to provide necessary advice about whether any harvests might be sustainable, and also maintain dependent ecosystem components. That's the other parts of the ecosystem, for example, marine mammals, seabirds, other components that depend on the fish that might be harvested. Number 3, looking at key ecological links between harvestable fish stocks and the adjacent shelf ecosystem. So this is direct from the COP. They're being quite clear. They want to go outside the convention or agreement area in potential impacts, and also including indigenous and local communities. There's also a forward-looking component here, and here's the question: over the next 10 to 30 years, what changes in fish populations, dependent species, and supporting ecosystems may occur in the Central Arctic and the adjacent shelf systems, which also means these peripheral seas and out into the gateways? And lastly, what indigenous knowledge and local knowledge is available, and how can it be taken into account to inform ecological baselines, along with the scientific knowledge that's already in hand from reports and publications, as well as the information that still needs to be gathered and brought in by collaborators and different types of syntheses. Next slide. There's the JPSRM, there's a framework document that outlines this in general. The implementation plan, which has more detail, is currently being drafted. And I just stuck this in here. This is too much to digest in our brief time, but it's guided by the guiding question there under the first purpose and approach. There are also a series of exploratory fishing questions that are being addressed by the JPSRM. As exploratory fishing may happen over the next dozen years or so, there's a moratorium right now on commercial fishing, but there's likely to be some exploratory fishing, and the guidance for that will come from the JPSRM through the COP. There's a mapping phase of this, which is to look over the next 2 to 3 years, kind of what's going on, shifting into a monitoring phase, which is a longer-term monitoring program, which is open-ended. Priorities include fish, mammals, seabirds, especially those that are subject to commercial or subsistence harvest. And on the indigenous side, of course, there are plenty of migratory species that are taken in subsistence, which range into the agreement area itself, as well as into the peripheral ecosystems and or seas and gateways. Priority parameters and methods, those are being worked out right now. They're the ones you'd expect from an ecological point of view: abundance, biomass, trends, distribution, size, diet, stock ID, key life events, and so forth. Information sources include both scientific and indigenous knowledge. Several of the delegations of the parties have a very robust participation of indigenous people on their delegation. So that is right there, and there's interest to reach out to other groups, for example, the Inuit Circumpolar Council. The last bullet on here is another part of the implementation plan and about external collaboration. And that's what I think there may be interest in IARPC for either being aware of or participating in joint data collection and analyses, sharing or coordinating research platforms, or other resources. Next slide. Oh, I'm watching my time. I didn't actually look to see when we started, but I know I don't have much time.
You're okay. You have a couple more. You're fine. You've got another 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, that'll work fine. Thanks, Jackie. Here's a quick flow chart of how this works. You've got the blue or the green at the top. Those are those research and monitoring questions. Can't find out everything, so there'll be a prioritization action. The central column here is what the SCG, Scientific Coordinating Group, will do, and its working groups. It goes through collecting, gathering information from external sources. On the left, published literature we brought in, On the right, external collaborating groups. I hope there are some in there. That'll be brought together, analyses, syntheses, maybe even in the data collection, and then reports and advice out to the COP. And it's the part on the right to which I want to draw your attention. There's too much to do for the SCG and the parties to CAOFA to do this themselves. And there are too many good, excellent, really, national, international, multinational research programs in progress now to not try to link arms with them and involve them, or at least involvement of the willing. And that's where I think IARPC might come in, both to maybe do things collaboratively or with data, certainly reports if they're published, but maybe actually at the working end. And you can see here how that sort of schematically might come together. Next. Did I put that in twice? Oh yeah, and there I've highlighted where that sort of external partners might be out there in the lighter yellow. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So the mapping and monitoring phase, that's one area where there might be opportunities for IARPC entities or parties to participate, data collection, sharing platforms, joint cruises, and so forth, or on the analytical or synthesis side. Next slide. Also on the data side of things, sharing data, and that can be a two-way street, working together to make progress on questions of common interest. And next slide. I think I have and these are the areas that might pertain in the Pacific or Atlantic gateways, the Central Arctic Ocean, fish, mammals, seabirds, lower end benthic species, and other ecosystem components. So it's quite a broad ecosystem approach on the research and monitoring side. That's the point I wanted to make on this. Next and near to last slide. Click again, please. What role might IARPC play in this? You know, scientific input's needed to help support the CAOFA work that's just getting off the ground now. Next. And you can click again. And that includes responses to the questions that are posed by the COP and will be posed in the future, and input to different types of assessments or answers to questions that are posed also that arise. And this is not just something for the next, year or two. The next year or two is a really important time to get things rolling, but this is an ongoing thing to support an international agreement that is binding. It's different than the Arctic Council. The decisions that are taken are binding on the member countries, 36 members with the EU in there. Nine, I think the EU is about 37 countries right now, plus the other 9 members. So it's a large group. Click again, please. And I think I just have a flag. That's the question to you guys. Is there interest in some kind of collaboration? I think there are opportunities. Next. Next slide. Yeah, you can read this. It's in all those geographic areas. The information provided would support conservation, sustainable use, wise management of marine living resources, and IARPC and others are invited to explore interest and mechanisms to work together on these common goals. And if successful, I see a way we have to work together. However we organize ourselves, that increases efficiency, saves money, promotes coordination, reduces potential duplication among all of our research programs. So I think that's my last slide. You can click again just to see if I've forgotten something. Yeah, that's it. So Jackie, that's my quick report, and I hope that's about what you were looking for. I think it's exciting, CAOFA, and they're getting rolling. And my personal view is the more that the US and all of the great things that we're doing, the more that we can be involved, we can participate in leading and setting CAOFA down a pathway that will benefit all the Arctic, high Arctic marine ecosystems and communities for generations. So this is really a key time for us to try to work together and see how we can help CAOFA and the SCG and the JPSRM launch and get going in a productive direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate the information on this, and I put a note in the chat. If people have questions, or put your hand up in the chat. We have opened up. We're going to be able to stay on about another 4 or 5 minutes. If there are questions for anybody specifically have for John. A question I would say while somebody thinks about something is how the interfacing for you see for like the ICES Pisces Payne working group on the integrated ecosystem assessment. Do you see the mechanism there and discussions, maybe some discussions you've had related to those activities that have done both the status and now they're doing a stressors evaluation?
I see a lot of linkage there, and we're just informally talking right now about but I mean, a lot of what the WGICA has done over the last several years already has gone a long way in starting to answer, or maybe even in some cases completely answer some of those guiding questions. And from my perspective, we'd be nuts not to take that on board, the printed reports, but also it's a lot of the same scientists and experts, and pursue conversations with them. I'm hoping that will be developed, and actually the SCG has directed me to reach out to those and other groups, ICES, Pisces, a number of other ones, CBMP in the Arctic Council, Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, Marine, for example. Jackie, you and I have talked about IASC and the Marine Working Group. So there's a bunch out there. And right now, as far as the SCG is concerned, there are no limits on us. We're kind of looking to see who would like to join a coalition of the willing.
Okay, great. Thanks for the answer. There's a question here from Anita regarding priorities. To what extent subsistence fishing is a priority, and thus indigenous science collected over thousands of years that has kept the region in balance is applied to subsistence protected areas? And then what implications for commercial fishing as part of an ecosystem approach? Thank you.
The first part, I think, was how does subsistence fishing pertain? I would say that it pertains in that the CAOFA does not regulate subsistence fishing. If their regulation, as I'm not a lawyer, but they regulate inside the agreement area on activities pertaining to commercial fisheries. But they want to have in mind, as they open or close areas or set quotas or talk about gear types or however they might regulate those activities, they clearly want to have, and they're directed by the agreement, to have in mind subsistence fisheries and harvests, whether it's fish, mammals, birds, for example. And there are migratory species of mammals and birds that do go out into that area. They have those subsistence harvests in mind and potential impacts from commercial fisheries which they authorize. I think that's what's being asked there. And what was the second part, Jackie?
And it says, and then what implications for commercial fishing as part of an ecosystem approach? So I guess it's how subsistence protected areas and what implications that might have for opening commercial fisheries. I think you covered a lot of it.
Yeah, okay, the ecosystem approach basically is the agreement talks about undertaking or regulating commercial fisheries in a way that such fisheries can be undertaken in a sustainable manner on the target harvested stocks, as well as not doing undue damage to the marine ecosystems and the whole dependent thing. For example, they have, I'll give an example, that I expect and the talk so far is, are there critically, are there seamounts with critically interesting and valuable benthic communities, sponges, and shall we come through there and drag the bottom without regulation when we don't even know what's on the bottom in there? There would be an example of an ecosystem approach in regulating a finfish fishery, but taking into account what damage might be done on benthic or say benthic, corals or sponge communities down there that are not taken in subsistence, but they're part of the ecosystem that the agreement directs the CAOFA to take into account.
Okay, thank you. And there's one final question, and I think unless something comes up, or I'll open it up, is Linda Fernandez asks, is there a focus on climate change increasing more flora and fauna into the CAO? So basically a biodiversity question. Do we see, with the opening of the sea ice and decline in the warming, that biodiversity questions would actually be part of a discussion?
I think I'm going to answer in two ways. I'll be surprised if there's not. And there's already, but it's too early to say much concrete because these discussions and the groups themselves are just standing up and starting to work. But the CAOFA Council of Parties, the COP, is already talking about, and they just passed, or they had adopted a draft, I guess now, of a climate resolution. So they're talking about climate, and they're talking about impacts and how systems are changing and all of that. So it's very much top of mind, but there's nothing very concrete. There have been no measures taken yet. I think the first conservation and management measures, probably pertaining to exploratory fishing, if they're adopted, will be adopted in June of 24. That's the next COP meeting.
Okay. All right.
And to this date, none have been taken.
All right. Thank you, John, very much for your presentation. And for Paul, I guess, we probably need to close out. The people have things to do, but if there's any last minute question anybody has for either for John or Paul, this would be the time to do it. Otherwise, I think we're going to close down. I don't see anything in the chat box. And Meredith, do you see anything in a hands up?
I don't know if you hear me, but you guys are the best.
So congratulations to the two speakers. That's the best compliment you can get.
And thank you very much. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in on the whole conversation, Paul. I'm sorry I missed the first part of your talk. I enjoyed listening to your the bits of answers I got at the end, but I'm in another session and I just couldn't do it. But I was really pleased to join all of you today. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you both for being on, and it has been recorded, so it'll eventually be posted on the IARPC Marine Ecosystem site. So I want to thank everybody for your time, and back to you, Meredith.
Thanks, everyone. I will close the meeting now. Really good to see you all.
All right.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Happy
Thank you.
holidays, guys.
Nice to see you, John.
Yeah.